1943, somewhere in the French countryside. The war was everywhere. It was in the air, in the sound of boots hitting the mud, in the quiet fear that lived in people's eyes. The Nazis had taken over towns, railroads, even farms. Soldiers marched down once peaceful roads like they owned them. And while generals were busy planning attacks with maps and radios, in a quiet corner of France, there was a farmer who didn't even own a gun. His name was Henri Dupont. Henri was 55, bald on top, with a belly from drinking too much of his own homemade wine. He didn't care much for politics or war. His world was bees. He had about 30 hives spread out across his land, and he treated his bees better than most men treated their wives. Even when German soldiers came knocking, taking food, wine, and even a cow once, Henri kept his mouth shut and nodded. But he never stopped working with his bees. What nobody knew, except maybe Henri, was that his bees were going to change the war. One morning in late March, a small group of American paratroopers crash-landed in the woods just beyond Henri's fields. They were lost, cold, and barely alive. Their mission had failed. Their plane had been hit, and the rest of their team was dead. They were trying to get back to the Allied lines, but the Germans were everywhere. Henri found them by accident. He was carrying a basket of honey jars to the village when he saw muddy boot prints leading into the trees. Following the prints, he found the soldiers huddled under a fallen tree, guns raised. Henri didn't flinch. He raised one hand, and in the other, he held out a jar of honey. They didn't trust him at first, but when he spoke in broken English, offering them food and shelter, they agreed. Henri brought them into his farmhouse, hid them in his cellar, and gave them bread, wine, and honey. "What the hell are we supposed to do now?" one soldier whispered to another that night. Henri heard them. He didn't speak much English, but he understood enough. They were scared, desperate, and out of ideas. The radios were gone. The escape routes were blocked. They needed a miracle. That night, as Henri sat near the fire, feeding his dog scraps of cheese, an idea began to grow in his mind. It was stupid, completely ridiculous, even for a man who talked to bees. But maybe, just maybe, it could work. The next morning, he visited his hives. The bees buzzed around him like always, not knowing a war was going on. He took several jars of fresh honey, then walked to the road that led to a nearby German outpost. He placed the jars in a basket, like always, and waited until the patrol passed by. When the soldiers stopped him, like they always did, Henri smiled and offered them a taste. "Honig," he said. "Fresh." The German soldiers laughed, dipped their fingers in, and took the jars. What they didn't know was that Henri had mixed in something special, tiny ground-up leaves from a plant that grew near the edge of the woods. The locals called it sleep leaf. It wasn't poison, but it made you dizzy, slow, and drowsy. In small doses, it just made you sleepy. In bigger doses, it knocked you out for hours. Over the next few days, Henri repeated this routine. Every morning, he delivered honey along the road, sometimes to patrols, sometimes to the guard post. And each time, he added a little more of the sleep leaf. It took only 3 days for things to change. The American soldiers, hiding in Henri's cellar, peeked out and noticed the patrols getting sloppier. The German soldiers started falling asleep at their posts. One even collapsed right outside Henri's barn. Another was seen throwing up behind a tree, his helmet off, his eyes dazed. Henri grinned like a man who had just won a bet with himself. The Americans couldn't believe it. They watched as Henri's trick with the honey made the German presence weaker and weaker. One of them, a young soldier from Texas named Miller, asked Henri what he was doing. Henri tapped his nose, then pointed at the bees. "Bees win war," he said, laughing. They didn't understand fully, but they got the point. This crazy old farmer, with his honey jars and bees, was turning the tide of the war right in his backyard, and nobody saw it coming. By the 5th day, Henri's honey had become a quiet legend among the German soldiers. They joked about how it made them feel dreamy, and some even started trading cigarettes just to get an extra spoonful. What they didn't realize was that Henri had begun increasing the dose of sleep leaf in every jar. Not enough to kill, just enough to dull their senses and weaken their grip on the area. The American soldiers hiding in his cellar were starting to believe they weren't just lucky survivors. They were part of something bigger. One of them, Sergeant Logan, tall, sharp-eyed and always pacing, was the first to speak the thought that was on everyone's mind. "We can't just sit here and wait to get found. If the Krauts are getting sloppy, we need to hit back." "Who's this?" Henri, standing at the cellar door with a lantern, looked down at them with a half-smile. He couldn't understand every word, but he got the meaning. He walked over, opened a wooden box, and revealed something that made Logan's jaw tighten. Inside were 3 rusted rifles and a crate of homemade explosives, likely from the resistance fighters who once passed through the region before disappearing. Henri simply said, "Boom." Over the next 2 nights, they planned something insane. Henri would deliver his usual honey jars, loaded with stronger doses of the sleep leaf, and the soldiers would strike the German outpost on the 7th day, when most of them would be too drowsy to fight or even hold their rifles straight. On the 6th day, a storm rolled in. Rain slapped the windows, and wind howled through the trees like wolves hungry for blood. But Henri still took his honey jars and disappeared down the muddy road, his boots splashing in the dark. Hours later, he returned soaked and smiling. "They eat," he said simply, hanging his wet coat. "They sleep." That night, the Americans got ready. They cleaned their weapons, passed around the last bits of dried bread and wine, and tied strips of cloth around their arms to identify each other in the dark. They weren't trained for this kind of ambush, but they were alive, and Henri had given them something they hadn't felt in weeks: hope. The morning of the attack, fog blanketed the hills like a heavy curtain. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Every step through the wet grass felt like it echoed. Henri led the way with a lantern, holding it low, avoiding the usual road, taking them through a narrow path behind the German outpost. The outpost itself wasn't large, just a wooden building, a radio tower, and 2 guard posts. Usually, it would have been guarded by at least 15 soldiers. But today, as the Americans peeked through the bushes, they counted only 5. 2 were sleeping at their posts. One was leaning against a wall, head bobbing like he was drunk. Logan whispered, "It's now or never." The Americans moved fast. They split into pairs, creeping through the fog like ghosts. One took out the radio operator before he could send a warning. Another disabled the vehicles, and 2 set explosives near the weapons storage. The Germans didn't stand a chance. Those who were awake were too dazed to react. One tried to fire his rifle but dropped it instead. Another fell over trying to stand. Within 10 minutes, the outpost was burning, the radio tower was in pieces, and not a single American was lost. Henri watched from the tree line, his eyes reflecting the firelight. His bees buzzed lazily around the fields behind him, unaware that they had just helped change the course of a battle. When it was over, Logan walked over to Henri and shook his hand with both of his. "You're a mad genius," he said, half laughing, half in shock. "That honey of yours should get a medal." Henri just patted Logan on the shoulder and replied in his broken English, "Stupid farmer. Stupid trick." Big boom. That night they didn't sleep. They couldn't. The adrenaline was too high. They knew more Germans would come, but they also knew they had done something impossible, with nothing but guts, bees, and honey. The sun hadn't even fully risen before the smoke from the destroyed outpost caught the attention of a German scout team stationed in a nearby village. Within hours, 2 trucks loaded with reinforcements were on their way to investigate the sudden radio silence. What they didn't expect to find was a burnt-out husk, unconscious guards still drooling from whatever had been in their systems, and not a single clue about who had attacked them. Henri and the Americans had already vanished into the woods. He knew the land like the back of his hand, every rabbit trail, every hollow log, and every creek bed that could hide tracks. He led the soldiers through a maze of hidden paths, eventually bringing them to an abandoned stone barn deep in the hills, one he used to store old beekeeping tools and spare parts. Inside, the Americans rested. Some cleaned their weapons again, others patched up minor wounds. But all of them were quiet, sitting in the flickering lantern light, trying to process what had just happened. Henri, on the other hand, was already preparing for what came next. He paced outside the barn, puffing on a hand-rolled cigarette, muttering to himself in French. He knew the Germans would be furious now. They would search every village, question every farmer, burn every barn if they had to. He also knew he couldn't just walk back to his farm. Inside, Sergeant Logan was scribbling notes on a torn piece of map, trying to figure out where the nearest Allied unit might be. "We're about 3 days away from the southern front, if we keep low and stay off the roads," he said. "But there's a bridge. Here," he pointed, "that we'll need to cross. And I guarantee it's watched." Henri looked over his shoulder at the map, then took a long drag from his cigarette and tapped his finger on the bridge without saying a word. "Trap," he finally said. Miller, the youngest of the group, groaned. "Great, so we either sit here and get caught or we walk into a trap." Henri looked at them, then smiled, a strange, mischievous smile. It was the same smile he wore when he first offered them honey in the cellar. "Bees go first," he said. The next day was spent preparing what Henri called la distraction des abeilles, the bee distraction. He returned to his hidden hives near the woods and collected not just honey, but live bees, contained in small wooden boxes with breathing holes. The Americans didn't know whether to laugh or panic. "You're telling me we're going to fight Nazis with bees?" Miller asked, raising an eyebrow. Henri grinned. "Angry bees?" "Very angry." With Henry's guidance, they packed the crates carefully, along with a few jars of honey, laced again with sleep leaf, and set off under the cover of night. Their plan was simple but insane. They would sneak close to the bridge checkpoint just before dawn, release the bees near the guard post, and use the chaos to storm the area. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was all they had. As the morning light began to bleed into the sky, the Americans crouched behind a row of thick bushes near the bridge. They could see the German guards, 6 of them half asleep, standing near a sandbag post. One was smoking. Another was urinating on a tree. None of them expected what came next. Henri crawled forward, carefully pulling the lids off 2 bee crates, whispering softly in French to his bees like they were soldiers themselves. The moment he lifted the last latch, the swarm burst out like a storm cloud, wild and angry. He gave the boxes a firm shake, just to rile them up, and threw them in the direction of the post. Within seconds, the air near the checkpoint filled with buzzing. Shouts in German erupted. One guard slapped his own face and screamed. Another dropped his rifle and ran into the river. It was chaos. That's when the Americans charged. Gunfire cracked through the morning stillness. The few Germans who weren't being attacked by bees couldn't aim straight with bees in their helmets and eyes. It was over in minutes. Logan stood over the last guard, breathing heavy, gun in hand. He looked back at Henri, who was calmly scooping a little honey onto a piece of bread from his pocket. "You're out of your damn mind," Logan said, shaking his head. Henri just shrugged. Bees hate Nazis. The bridge was theirs. The bees had done more than bullets ever could. They had spread confusion, panic, and fear faster than any grenade. The 6 German guards lay either unconscious, tied up, or swollen with stings, while Henri and the Americans gathered whatever supplies they could find. Ammo, maps, rations, and most importantly, transport. A rust-covered army truck sat parked under a camo net on the edge of the checkpoint. It was still in decent shape, and with some quick wire work from Corporal Jenkins, the team had it roaring within minutes. The vehicle was loud, too loud, but it was fast, and speed was now their only option. Henri climbed in the back with the bee crates and supplies, while Logan and Miller sat up front. The others secured the tied-up Germans and left them in the guard post, alive but humiliated, drenched in honey and covered in stings. "They'll have a real sweet story to tell," Miller joked, wiping sweat from his brow. As the truck roared south through winding country roads, Henri leaned back against the wooden crates, lighting a cigarette. His face looked calm, but his mind was racing. He knew the Germans would now put a bounty on his head. He wasn't just a harmless farmer anymore. He was a saboteur, a threat. Logan glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "You still with us, old man?" Henri didn't answer immediately. He blew out a long stream of smoke and said, "I was never with you. You came to me?" They all chuckled, but they knew he was right. Henri hadn't joined the war. The war had come to his doorstep. The roads grew narrower, the air more tense. They were approaching the edge of a forest that led toward the Allied front lines, or what they hoped was still Allied-controlled territory. But things never went smooth for long. An hour into the drive, they heard it, the deep growl of engines behind them. Logan checked the mirror. "We've got company, a convoy." 2 German bikes and a small armored vehicle were closing in fast. The Nazis had already responded, and this time they weren't sleepy or stung. "Floor it!" someone yelled. The truck jolted as Logan pushed the pedal to the floor, but the old machine wasn't built for speed. The motorcycles were gaining. Bullets began to ping off the sides. Henri, now gripping the edge of the truck bed, looked around desperately. He saw the bee crates, only 3 left. He also saw an open jar of honey. Without hesitation, he dipped his fingers in the honey, then wiped it on the inside walls of the crates. The bees, sensing the sticky sweetness, began to stir, confused and aggressive. Henri picked up one crate, balanced it at the back of the truck, and waited. A German soldier on a motorcycle pulled up close, aiming his submachine gun. Just as he opened fire, Henri let the crate drop. The box smashed open right in front of the bike. A thick, furious cloud of bees swarmed forward like smoke with teeth. The German screamed, lost control, and slammed into a ditch. The second bike tried to dodge the scene, but Henri was already ready with the second crate. He didn't drop it this time, he threw it. It cracked open mid-air and sprayed bees like a grenade. "Is he throwing bees at them?" Jenkins shouted from inside the truck, ducking down. "Hell yeah, he is," Miller laughed. "I love this guy." The last vehicle was the armored one, slow but deadly. Its mounted gun opened fire, ripping holes through the side of the truck. Shrapnel grazed Henry's shoulder. He fell back, blood oozing through his shirt. "Henri!" Logan shouted, slamming the brakes and sliding the truck into a sharp turn off the road, down a steep embankment. They crashed through bushes and small trees, eventually rolling to a stop in a dry creek bed. Smoke poured from the engine. Henri sat up slowly, grimacing, one hand pressed against his wound. "You okay?" Miller asked, rushing to his side. Henri coughed, then smiled through bloodied teeth. "It's just a bee sting." The armored vehicle couldn't follow. They'd lost them for now, but their ride was done. They were back on foot, deep in enemy land, with 1 injured old farmer and 2 crates of bees. "Now what?" Jenkins muttered. Logan looked around, then at Henry. "We walk, we fight, and we protect the man who just weaponized nature." Henry looked at the trees ahead and whispered, "The forest will protect us. I have friends there." The forest was alive with whispers, leaves rustling, birds crying warnings, twigs snapping under tired boots. It was the kind of place where the light barely touched the ground and shadows danced like ghosts. But Henri moved like he belonged there, even with blood dripping slowly from his shoulder. Logan walked beside him, keeping one hand on his rifle and one eye on the path ahead. The rest of the squad stayed alert, scattered just enough to avoid being easy targets, but close enough to defend each other if it came to that. Henri stopped suddenly, beside a moss-covered tree stump, and tapped it twice with the butt of his walking stick. Everyone froze. Logan raised his rifle slightly. "What is it?" Henri didn't speak. He just stared at the stump, then bent down and pushed aside the moss. Underneath was a rusted metal latch. With some effort, he lifted it, revealing a narrow tunnel entrance, just big enough for a grown man to crawl through. "What the hell is this?" Miller whispered, squinting into the hole. "Old wine smuggler tunnel," Henry said. "Before the war. Now it's more useful." They didn't argue. One by one, they climbed down into the earth, crawling through damp, tight darkness. The air smelled of dirt, old wood, and something faintly sweet. Maybe Henry's honey had seeped into the soil after all those years. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged into a hidden cellar beneath an abandoned hunting lodge. Dust floated in beams of golden light, coming through cracks in the boards above, and crates of dried goods, tools, and a few forgotten bottles of brandy lined the walls. Henri collapsed onto a stack of hay and let out a slow breath. Logan knelt beside him and began bandaging the wound properly with torn cloth and a tiny bottle of alcohol. Henri flinched but didn't complain. "You know this place well?" Logan asked. Henri nodded. "My grandfather built it. for hiding barrels from taxmen. Never thought I'd use it to hide from Nazis. They all chuckled, but the laughter was tight, hollow. They knew they couldn't stay long. The Germans would be searching every inch of the region after the bridge attack. And Henry's face was likely burned into every officer's memory by now, the old man with the bees. As they rested, Henry pulled something from a dusty crate, a small map, hand-drawn, old but still readable. He spread it out on the floor and pointed at a spot marked with an X. Here, there is a French resistance outpost, maybe 20 kilometers. Logan raised an eyebrow. You sure they're still active? Henry gave a half-smile. If they're not, we make them active again. By nightfall, they moved. Henry was weak but refused to be carried. He walked with a stick, gritting his teeth. The bees, now reduced to one buzzing crate, were slung over Jenkins' back like treasure. They made their way south through the thick forest, sticking to game trails and dry creek beds. But just before dawn, everything went wrong. A flare shot into the sky not far behind them, bathing the trees in harsh white light. Then shouting. German voices, footsteps, dogs. They'd been tracked. Move, Logan barked. No more hiding. They broke into a run, ducking between trees, slipping on roots, branches slashing at their faces. Gunfire cracked behind them. Miller cried out as a bullet grazed his leg but kept running. Henri, breath ragged, veered left suddenly and shouted, Here, down! They followed him into a narrow ravine, half hidden by underbrush. It led down into a shallow pit, surrounded by thick stones. Henri pointed at the crate Jenkins still carried. Open it, he gasped. Now! Jenkins hesitated. But the bees, now! Jenkins dropped the crate and yanked it open. The buzzing exploded into a furious hum as a black cloud rose into the air. Henry grabbed a small pouch from his coat, ripped it open, and tossed it into the swarm. The bees went wild, swirling and charging toward the noise behind them, toward the Germans. Screams followed almost instantly. Gunfire turned wild. Dogs yelped and ran. One German fell to the ground, clawing at his face, while another sprinted straight into a tree, trying to escape. The Americans kept running. They didn't stop until the sky turned orange with sunrise, and the sound of chaos faded into distant echoes. They collapsed in a clearing, gasping for breath. Logan looked at Henry, who was pale and shaking but still standing. You just used your last crate. Henri nodded slowly. No more bees. Just us now. Miller, still limping, added, Then let's sting like hell. They all laughed, tired, breathless, wounded, but alive, and still not finished. The morning sun broke through the treetops, painting the forest floor in strips of gold and shadow. Every breath the soldiers took felt like fire in their lungs, their legs trembling from the endless run. They'd lost the last crate of bees, and probably lost the Germans in the process, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the calm before the next storm. Henry leaned against a tree, face pale, his wounded shoulder soaked through with blood again. Logan knelt beside him, checking the bandage. It was bad. Too much running. Too much bleeding. You need real help, Logan muttered. Soon, Henri gave a weak chuckle. No time to die. Not until I see their faces when they lose. He was stubborn, still full of fire, but Logan saw it in his eyes. The old man was fading, and unless they reached the resistance soon, they'd all be ghosts in this forest. They had just started moving again when Miller, scouting a few feet ahead, held up a fist and dropped to a knee. The others froze, instincts kicking in. Then they heard it, a voice. 2, maybe 3 people speaking in fast, hushed French. Henry's eyes lit up. Wait, he whispered, I know that voice. Logan motioned for everyone to stay low as Henry stepped forward, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. He pushed past a low bush and into a small clearing where 3 figures stood, armed, dirty, tense. Resistance fighters. One of them, a tall woman with a rifle slung over her back, turned at the sound. Her expression hardened, finger moving toward the trigger. Henry raised both hands. Lucille. The woman blinked, stunned. Henri, Dieu du ciel. We thought you were dead. She rushed forward, hugging him gently, then helping him sit on a log. The other 2 resistance fighters stood ready, staring at the Americans with suspicion, until Logan stepped forward and introduced the team. Lucille's face darkened as she listened to the story. The honey, the bees, the sabotage, the firefight at the bridge, the escape through the woods. You did all that. With bees? She asked, almost smiling. You're more insane than we thought. Insane wins wars, Henri said through gritted teeth. They moved quickly after that, guiding the Americans through a hidden trail that led to a small village hollowed out by war. Half the homes were abandoned. The other half were used by the resistance, storage, planning, shelter. In the cellar of an old bakery, Logan and his team were finally able to rest. Henri was treated first. Lucille herself stitched his wound with a steady hand and old thread. You're lucky, she said, tightening the last knot. Any deeper, and you'd be explaining bee tricks to St. Peter. Henri just groaned and fell asleep. Logan and the rest sat at a long wooden table with a map laid out. Lucille pointed to German movements, explaining that after the bridge attack, the region had gone into lockdown. Patrols had doubled. Air recon was sweeping the southern forest. The Nazis were hunting ghosts and they were terrified. You lit a fire, Lucille said. Now we have to fan the flames. Logan leaned in. What do you have in mind? She hesitated, then looked over at a dusty crate in the corner of the cellar. It was marked with faded red letters, explosives. There's a supply train, she said. German, full of weapons, fuel, ammo. It moves through a valley near here every 3 days. If we hit it, we don't just hurt them, we set them back for weeks. Logan nodded slowly. You want my team to help? Lucille grinned. No, I want your crazy farmer. Henri, still half asleep on the cot, opened one eye and said, If you've got sugar, I can find bees. Everyone laughed, but Logan knew it wasn't a joke. Henri had become more than a beekeeper. He was a weapon the Germans never saw coming. As the sun dipped low again, the plan was forming. A final blow, one more sting. But this time it wouldn't just be bees. It would be fire. And Henri, bleeding, bruised, half-broken, was ready to bring it. The night before the mission, the resistance hideout buzzed with quiet tension. No one slept deeply. Maps were studied by candlelight. Guns were cleaned again and again. Every whisper carried weight. Every glance meant something unspoken. Henri sat at the end of the table, his arm freshly bandaged and cradled in a cloth sling. His face was drawn, his hands still shaking faintly from blood loss, but his eyes, they were sharper than ever. He had a plan, a ridiculous one. But after what he'd already pulled off, no one dared question it. Lucille paced in front of a map pinned to the cellar wall. She jabbed a finger at a narrow bend in the rail line that snaked through a dense patch of forest just outside a crumbling village. The train passes through here at dawn. It slows for a maintenance check. No guards on board, just supplies and a couple engineers. We hit it there, fast and hard, one shot. No second chances. Logan leaned in. And how exactly do we blow a train with no heavy weapons? Henri smiled slowly. With the Queen's wrath, everyone turned. He nodded at a sack beside him, filled with jars of honey, bundles of dry cloth, and small glass bottles containing a thick, dark oil that reeked of smoke and sap. Molotovs? Jenkins asked, raising an eyebrow. Henri shook his head. Better. They're sticky. Burn longer. Honey mixed with pine oil. It clings to metal. Won't wash off. Won't go out. Lucille stared at him, half in disbelief. You're making firebombs with honey? He simply replied, Sweet death. By midnight, the group was on the move. 10 resistance fighters, 5 Americans, and Henri, riding in a creaky cart pulled by a borrowed horse. His bag of fire sat beside him, clinking softly with every bump in the road. Moonlight guided them to the edge of the forest, where the tracks curved through the valley like a silver ribbon. They split into teams. One group positioned themselves near the track switch with a bundle of explosives, just in case. Another prepared the Molotov honey bombs, wrapping cloth around the tops of each bottle and dousing them in Henri's special mix. Henri himself limped toward a tree stump near the tracks, carrying a box carefully wrapped in cloth. He knelt, opened the lid, and released a small swarm of bees into the night. They won't fly far in the cold, Miller said quietly, standing beside him. They won't have to, Henri replied. Just enough to make noise. Confuse them. Make them panic. And then They waited. The cold crept in, biting through gloves and coats. Time slowed to a crawl. Every crack of a branch made hearts jump. Every gust of wind sounded like the growl of an engine. Then at last they heard it, the low, grinding rumble of the supply train. Lucille whispered into her field radio, "All units, ready." The train appeared like a monster in the dark, its front light glowing like a single unblinking eye. It hissed and shrieked as it hit the bend, slowing to a crawl. That was their moment. "Go," Logan ordered. From the trees, bottles flew. The first bomb hit the fuel cart, glass shattering and sticky fire spreading instantly across the metal. Flames licked the sides of the train, and smoke billowed upward like a black flag. Another hit the engine cabin, and the two engineers inside leapt out, screaming, their coats ablaze. Henri tossed his last bottle himself. It hit the wheels near the rear cart and exploded into a firestorm, sticking like tar, turning steel red-hot. The train screeched to a halt. Lucille's team rushed in, rifles raised, taking position. But there was no one left to fight, no guards, no gunfire. Just a train filled with crates of ammunition, Nazi flags, and fuel drums, now melting in their own supply line. Within minutes, the entire rail bend was a burning inferno, and still no enemy backup arrived. The Germans had grown complacent in this quiet corner of France. But not anymore. Henri stood at the edge of the tracks, bathed in the firelight, breathing heavily. His work was done. Logan walked over, clapped him on the shoulder gently. "You just burned their war machine with bees and breakfast," Henri smirked. "Told you." Stupid trick. And then, behind them, the forest lit up, not with flames, but with voices, cheering. Dozens of villagers had come from nearby, seeing the smoke. They stood at the edge of the woods, watching the train burn, eyes wide, faces lit with hope. Lucille turned to Logan. "We didn't just destroy supplies tonight." "No," Logan said, watching Henri raise a hand to the crowd. "We started a fire in their hearts." By the next morning, the story had already begun to spread. Not through radios, not through newspapers, but through whispers, passed from farmer to butcher, from old women to children running barefoot through the fields. A train had been destroyed in the south, a German supply line set ablaze, and at the center of it all was a half-mad farmer with bees and honey, who had turned Nazi steel into ash. They called him l'apiculteur du feu, the beekeeper of fire. Henri, however, didn't feel like any kind of legend. He was exhausted. His body ached in places he didn't know could ache. His wounded arm was throbbing again, and his legs could barely carry him. But as he sat in the corner of a crumbling church-turned-hideout, drinking weak coffee and eating stale bread, he watched something shift in the people around him. They were no longer just surviving. They were planning. Dozens of villagers had joined Lucille's resistance cell overnight. Blacksmiths, carpenters, shepherds, even an old priest offered his cellar for storage. The Americans had been folded into the unit like brothers. And Henri was now treated with the strange mix of awe and affection, usually reserved for saints and madmen. Logan sat beside him, holding a fresh map. High Command heard about the train. A British agent got word through enemy lines. "They're rerouting their southern strategy because of you." Henri raised an eyebrow. "Because of bees," Logan laughed. "Yeah, they even want to give you a medal. If we make it through this," Henri stared at the map. "Medals don't grow crops." That afternoon, a courier arrived with news. The Germans had put a 20,000-mark bounty on Henri's head. Posters had already gone up across the occupied towns. Wanted Henri Dupont, saboteur, arsonist, enemy of the Reich, dead or alive. When Lucille showed him the poster, Henri didn't blink. He just looked at his reflection in a broken window and muttered, "Finally famous." But fame came with danger. 2 nights later, the enemy came looking. A traitor from a nearby village had tipped off a patrol about the resistance hideout. The soldiers came silent, crawling through the mist just before dawn. 30 of them, armed to the teeth. They surrounded the old church, where Henri and the others had set up base. Logan was the first to hear it, the crunch of boots outside. "Positions!" he hissed. Everyone scrambled. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, and the element of surprise was gone. Henri grabbed his old hunting rifle but dropped it halfway, his arm too weak to lift it. Lucille rushed to the back cellar. "We've got to fall back through the tunnel. We won't survive a full assault." But Henri wasn't moving. He stood near the doorway, staring at something on the table. It was a single crate, his last bee box, untouched, forgotten. The bees had grown quiet, dormant. Henri stepped forward slowly and whispered to them in French. "Wake up, Miss Soldats. One more time." Logan looked at him. "No, you're hurt. You can't—" "I don't need to run," Henri said softly. "I need to buy you time." "No way in hell we're leaving you," Miller snapped. Henri didn't argue. Instead, he grabbed the bee crate, dipped his fingers into a jar of honey on the table, smeared it across his chest and collar like war paint, and walked toward the front door. Lucille's voice cracked. "Henri, don't you dare!" He turned to her with a tired smile. "They want l'apiculteur du feu? Then let them meet him." Then he opened the door. Outside, the Germans had just breached the fence. They froze at the sight of the old man stepping into the morning light, honey dripping down his coat, a wooden crate in his arms. For a long second, no one moved. And then Henri dropped the box. The bees, disturbed, enraged, wild, erupted into the air. Henri opened his arms wide and shouted, "For France!" It was chaos. Again, bees swarmed the soldiers. Gunfire went wild. Screams filled the air. And behind it all, Lucille and Logan led the resistance fighters through the cellar tunnel, escaping into the hills. By the time they returned an hour later, the church was empty, and Henri Dupont was gone. No body, no sign, just a broken crate, and a swarm of bees circling silently above. They never found him, but the stories grew. About the farmer who fought Nazis with honey, about the bees who defended their land, and about how, in the heart of war, one man used nature, madness, and courage to turn the tide. The beekeeper of fire had disappeared, but his sting was eternal.